Hello everybody and welcome to a special video where Travis, Brendan, and myself are going to talk about the differences between Arkham Horror the card game and Lord of the Rings the card game, because both of these living card games from Fantasy Flight Games, well, not both of them, but they're both receiving a new release model which can really allow for easier access into the game. Arkham Horror the card game has been running consistently since 2015. I think it was 2015. Holy cow if it was. And then Lord of the Rings, the card game, has been running for longer, but it's been on a hiatus for a bit, but has recently come out with a revised core set and some new starter decks and all that. So I've had a lot of people ask, what is the difference between them? Should I play Lord of the Rings if I'm playing Arkham Horror, the card game? And today we're going to just talk a little bit about what we like about each of the games, and it's going to just be nice and fun and hopefully helps guide you to what you might want to purchase. So I'm going to do a quick summary before we get into the actual discussion we have here. But for Arkham Horror, the card game, so on this one, you take on the role of an investigator with unique deck building rules. This is different than Lord of the Rings, which we'll get to on the next slide. You're going to build a deck of 30 cards, that's usually, and upgrade it over an 8-scenario campaign, usually. So the campaign system tells a unique story with the decisions that provide rewards and consequences. So this one, unlike Lord of the Rings, you play a structured story, and your choices matter, and they ripple forward, and you can sometimes get eliminated in the middle of your story. Likewise, as you're playing through this, your character is going to earn story items, and you also will upgrade your deck and become a stronger character throughout it. So you're going to have 8 scenarios where you're playing one investigator. The game also has a map-based play area, which allows for variation and additional decisions for the players. This is actually kind of quietly really huge, because Lord of the Rings, the card game, has a staging area, which is just where bad cards go. And then your actions are pretty structured. However, just introducing a map that Arkham Horror has, it immediately makes it so that now the decision trees for players open up. I would say that Arkham Horror has more choices that you can make, which is, if you kind of like the more decision kind of making process, I think Arkham Horror has a little win there. As well, it has a new release format that makes this the best time ever to enter this game. It makes me jealous, but, we don't have to tell people to buy 2 core sets anymore, which is kind of huge, because everyone would be like, why do I have to buy 2 core sets? And I'm like, good point, but you kind of have to.
Look, do you want 2 beat cops or not?
Yeah. And likewise, that actually also carries over into Lord of the Rings, the card game, because you didn't have to buy 2 copies of the core set back in the day. You had to buy 3 copies of the core set. So really, we actually got lucky with Arkham. We had it so good. So in Lord of the Rings, the card game, you're going to build a team of up to 3 heroes and utilize 4 spheres to build your 50-card deck. So this is a little bit different, where you don't have just one investigator playing. You're going to have up to 3 heroes, and then you aren't really limited to what you can include in your deck, but you can only play with the spheres that your hero has. There's 4 colors. In Arkham, there are 5 colors. We call them colors, factions, whatever, spheres, whatever they call them in the official rulebook. We don't know. We don't know those here. You can adjust your deck for Lord of the Rings between scenarios, allowing you to adjust for any weaknesses your deck may have to a scenario. Lord of the Rings, the card game, is a little bit more puzzly. You're kind of having to, you kind of have to build for a scenario. Sometimes cards just won't work in a scenario, so it kind of teaches you that you might fail a scenario, but then you can revisit it and try it again. This game also heavily promotes deck building, allowing you to easily try out different ideas against scenarios. Well, I'm sure we're going to talk about more when we get this into the next slide here, as we talk about the comparisons between the 3 of us. But this game really promotes its deck building because you're not locked into one deck for 8 plays. There is a campaign mode for some releases, but it is a lot looser than Arkham's. And when I mean a lot looser, it's a lot looser.
You can't change your heroes.
Yeah,
You can change literally anything else.
And there's also another campaign mode where you can change your heroes, but only if they die. It's a little bit, it's just it's not nearly as rewarding. While the individual scenarios are very thematic in Lord of the Rings, the card game, it's not nearly as a cohesive story that's like connected from scenario to scenario that you're going to feel in Lord of the Rings, the card game. And as I said, this game is also receiving a new release model and just received a revised core set and new starter decks. If you're just starting this game out and you want to grab the core set and like 1 or 2 of the starter decks, you're going to get a lot of game for it. A lot of nice stuff. These 2 boxes, they each come with 3 scenarios, and they kind of follow a very similar structure where you have your intro one that's pretty easy, your middle one that's kind of spicy and throws a twist at you, and then the last one, which can be very swingy. So I'm going to now open the floor to Bryn, because Bryn, you and I have been playing this a bunch recently, so you'll know more. Like Travis, as we said before, he hasn't played Lord of the Rings since 5 years. But I want to start with you, Bryn, for what you view as like how they compare for you in terms of play style and all that.
Yeah. So the Arkham Horror, the card game, is much more of a storytelling game. There are a whole lot more memorable moments that have come out of Arkham Horror for me than have come out of Lord of the Rings. Although occasionally you do get you're fighting a Balrog and you're like, I guess Gimli's got to fight this guy. And then, you play four copies of Khazad, and he just goes down like a sack of shit. And you're like, oh my God. We're done here.
And then
We
done
don't
here
have to find
says,
a way
I'm
to
done
stay
here.
alive. Yeah. Or done here being literal bug spray.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. There are not so many of those that have come out of Lord of the Rings than have come out of Arkham Horror, the card game. I do appreciate the more puzzle gamey aspects of Lord of the Rings, where you often show up to a scenario with a deck and you're like, yeah, my deck's pretty good. And the game's like, can you kill 17 orcs in the first 4 turns? And you're like, no. No, I didn't bring cards to do that. I guess I'm going to have to try again because we're just dead. Bring some different cards to see how that works. Which is something you very much can't do in Arkham Horror because you're on to the next one. That's how it goes. Unless you died. Unless all of you died. Yeah, that deck building is the fun part to me, the most fun part. So that does appeal to me a little more out of Lord of the Rings than it does out of Arkham Horror. Because if I try something stupid in Arkham Horror and it is stupid, I am just stuck with it for the next 3 weeks. As opposed to Lord of the Rings, where it's like if I put together something stupid, like I don't know, a deck where the synergy between my cards is that all of them have bear in their name or are a bear, and it doesn't work, that's cool. That's cool. Next time we'll build a real deck.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's, to go to the puzzle aspect of this game, I think Lord of the Rings generally is also harder than Arkham, just because it's kind of more unfair than Arkham. Arkham is very balanced in terms of giving the players a shot, even on standard. Standard Lord of the Rings is going to kick you in the throat, even just standard. And
sometimes.
Yeah. And players will learn this really quickly in the second scenario in Lord of the Rings, the card game. That one has a much bigger difficulty spike than the 1 to 2 in Arkham Horror, the card game. I will say 2 to 3 in Arkham is a bigger spike than 2 to 3 for Lord of the Rings, but Lord of the Rings is going to teach you early on that you need to adjust your decks to match this. So when you're playing Lord of the Rings, if you don't like the idea of drawing the first 2 turns and then being like, okay, we've lost. This has happened to Bryn and I many times in our series. We're just like, okay, we're going to shuffle up and just go again.
Yeah.
Now, Travis, I want to go throw the floor to you now for your thoughts on just kind of this.
I'm not really a fan of the constant mulliganing aspect of Lord of the Rings. To me, that feels like, I mean, if you're just going to sit down and give up till you get a good start, what's the point? But also, sometimes you are just dead, and there's no point in playing. And, I mean, it's... I'm definitely on the Arkham side of this debate. It's like I don't want to sit down and watch, or sit down and just like redraw my hand 3 times. So I'm like, okay, we get to play the game now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like the story aspect of Arkham a little bit more than I didn't like the pressure that Lord of the Rings had, where I felt like I had to alter my deck between each scenario to make it like as good as possible to try and beat the given scenario. I'd much rather sit down with a deck that is like, you know, it's going to be good at some things, but it is going to have weaknesses, and try to navigate through a scenario that way.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed, like, I'd like to sit down if I'm going to play for 5 hours. I want to sit down and play for 5 hours, and not sit down and play for 2 hours and spend 3 hours deck building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. For me, I think all of I mean, I can't speak for Bryn, but I know I'm also I'm more towards Arkham Horror. Like, I still love Lord of the Rings, the card game. When Lord of the Rings, the card games gets flavorful, it can get really flavorful. And there are times where, like, there are some scenarios where your deck can work against it, and then there are some where you'll have to adjust. This is specifically for, like, the few scenarios that are, like, really hard. Most of the time you can get through with something, but it is, what Travis is saying is 100% true. Like, you need to have a bit more focus, and, like, the scenarios will exploit your weaknesses a lot more than a scenario like Arkham Horror would, because they're kind of like a little bit more balanced to work for everybody, and also to work in like Lord of the Rings doesn't care if you're playing true solo. It's gonna beat the crap out of you even if you're not. Arkham Horror, the card game, it does care if people can play true solo, so it's kind of designed for that beyond outside of like maybe the first cycle. Anything else that you guys want to add here?
No.
Yeah, there are definitely, like, you are right. There are a lot of niche cards in Lord of the Rings that behave like fine clothes out of Arkham Horror, such as the Iron Hills Miner, where most of the time they're kind of all right, but sometimes you get put in a sack by a troll, and you got to find a way to get your guy out of the sack before the troll sits on him and turns him into jelly. So it's a lot of our mulligans have been things like that, where it's, you know, you draw something as like, cool, so this character just doesn't play the game anymore. Hey, all right, well, let's try again, but with cards to stop that.
Yeah.
As opposed to Arkham Horror, where you can, like, when fine clothes is good, it's good, but also the scenarios it's good in, you don't have to have it.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not so much of a necessity as it is in Lord of the Rings, where it's like, cool, but if you don't have Iron Hills Miner in your deck, like, this is gonna suck. Or if you don't have Test of Will in your deck, this might not be great.
Yeah, Test of Will, for people who know Arkham Horror, it's ward of protection. It stops an evil card. Yeah, too. And then also for Lord of the Rings as well, I'm talking about how it's difficult. There actually is an easy mode to the game as well. And it is noticeably easier than standard. Like, there's a card, for example, that is included in the standard set, which is just you have to, like, all your characters lose 2 in a stat, and then anyone with 0 just gets fucking killed. If you play on easy mode, that card's taken out. So it's like a great way to still play the game, and it actually will probably lead to less mulligans and less focused deck building if you do prefer that style. There is a hard mode, but it requires buying nightmare packs, and I'm honestly too scared to play them right now, but I'm sure Bryn and I will get to them eventually. But those require a separate thing to play on the hard mode of the game. So there's the easy, standard, which you can play just in the box as included. And it is noticeably easier. Yeah. So then it's a little bit, the economy in Lord of the Rings feels very lopsided in a way that you kind of like need to hit certain cards as well. I'm hoping if they release new cycles, they can kind of fix that a bit and kind of look at it how it is. But like, there's certain times, like with Arkham Horror, everyone can kind of just build something and it can work. But in Lord of the Rings, you have to have a lot of dialogue with the people you're at the table with, which is like, are you playing Steward of Gondor? No? Okay, I'm going to play Steward of Gondor, right? It's kind of just like you need those cards, which is another kind of like downside. But I still think the game's very fun and I love playing it. But if you want like a more like story-based, you don't need to adjust and build as much, Arkham Horror is great for that. Sick. I think that's good. Bryn, do you have anything else you want to add, or should I close this guy out?
I think that's good.
Sweet. Huge thank you to everyone who watched. If you had any questions, please let me know down in the comments. I will get to them. I will respond. And thanks so much for watching. If you want to see me do this for other games like Arkham Horror and Marvel Champions, I can do that as well. I would be happy to do that and help you make the best informed decision for what you should spend your money on for what you want from the playstyle out of the game. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good one. And as always, GG's.